we're still in a world, and sports should never give this thing up, is that we all still want to create this cultural moment where everyone is watching the same thing and talking about it at the same time. That is ultimately how you break through, right? And that is ultimately how you create these cultural moments that people are talking about all the time.
As media consumption habits continue to change, can professional sports still bring people together in the same ways they used to? Welcome to Marketing Trends. I'm Jeremy Bergeron. Our guest today is Emeka Ofodile, the Vice President of Sports Marketing at ESPN. Emeka has seen sports fandom significantly change over the last couple of decades. Tune in to hear the innovative strategies from his marketing playbook that have helped ESPN continue to connect with the modern sports fan. And before we get into the podcast, I want to give a special shout out to our sponsor, Salesforce. Salesforce brings marketing and engagement together. Learn more at salesforce.com/marketing. Now let's get into it. My first question is just a super easy one, Emeka, and I just want to understand how you manage global brand strategies for this portfolio at ESPN of sports properties. I mean, you have these massive brands with so much content and experience happening across, the big ones, NFL, NBA, college football, MLB, NHL. There's a long list of them. How do you manage just global brand strategies for all of these properties? Like, how is that even done beyond an amazing supported team? How do you view that from your perspective, looking at each of these really interesting, each of these brands within this portfolio?
It's a great question. And I think you started off the right way, right? Like, you can't necessarily do it without sort of a great team that is helping sort of achieve that. I think when you think about sort of the sports portfolio, the way we look at it is like, all right, there are essentially like two major jobs, right? One is this idea of consumption, right? So like our business is we want to drive as many people to tune in to our sports events, to subscribe to ESPN Plus or to use, whether it's our fantasy football app, but it's like this idea of consumption. We want sports fans to consume our sports content, and that ranges across, viewership to, subscribing. The other part too is this idea of brand, right? We want to leverage, this portfolio, the sports portfolio we have to build like a close and deep relationship sports fans have with ESPN through live sports. So those are like the kind of like the two things that we think about. Then every sport ultimately plays a role in doing so, right? So, but like at the same time, it's all connected. Like, and that's one of the things I love about sort of as you think about the sports portfolio. Yes, you can move from a NHL to a UFC to an NFL to an NBA, but ultimately what that does is like it gives you this like purview, this view on what's happening with the sports fan. So seeing how, the fan is behaving on NBA could be relevant to seeing like what happens on college football, could be then relevant to seeing what happens on NFL, right? So it's ultimately at the end of the day, like it's all kind of connected, but essentially like every sport has a job that it has to do and a role it has to play. And ultimately, we have to look at it at a high level of like, how can this sport drive our, like the ESPN brand, but also how can we sort of drive as many people to consume these sports on ESPN? So like, that's kind of like a kind of easy sort of macro way to think about it.
So backing up a little bit, because I look at your, career on paper, it's like you essentially became a marketer at ESPN. Yeah. Like you became a marketer, and not only that, you became a marketing leader at ESPN as well. But at Columbia, did you study marketing at Columbia?
No, I didn't. I was an economics political science major.
Okay.
But the thing I always love telling the story about is, I've always had a passion for marketing, right? So I took a seminar class my senior year, right? So the class was called Executive Leadership. It's one of those sort of like last pieces of key things to completing your major. And, in that class, we have to write this paper, right? At the end of it. And, the whole idea was it's executive leadership. So everyone sort of writes about like, who do we think have been great executive leaders, throughout the course of history, right? So folks wrote about Lincoln and JFK. So my sort of selection was like, hey, I was going to write about executive leadership within the athletic footwear industry, right? So my whole paper ended up being about sort of like how Nike was able to, overtake Adidas and Reebok at the time, and so half that paper, and it was about Phil Knight, right? But half that paper was sort of focused on this idea of, at the time, how Nike created this concept of sports marketing, and sports marketing in terms of like really kind of connecting with, consumers emotionally and through this sort of storytelling, and how they did it with, the agency that they've had for a bunch of years, Wyden Kennedy. I was sort of seeing like my passion point of like marketing and sports marketing come through. And at the time, I loved what ESPN was doing. I think everyone like were watching like, this is Sports Center commercials and everything else. So like that was, where I knew that I wanted to make a difference in the sports marketing space. And that's something I tell people a lot is like, look at your everyday, look at what you're like leaning into, and then ultimately see how that kind of connects into what you can bring to it professionally.
What did you gravitate towards once you started at ESPN? Because you started again over 20 years ago. What was you get into this organization? There's a lot of lanes you can get into. There's a lot of interesting parts of the business and things people are working on. Where did you start? Like, and what did you notice, and what got your attention when you first started?
Started entry level, and I was so fortunate to, I still remember like getting there was tough, right? Like I always tell people the importance of informational interviews. I think I did like 40 informational interviews before like I actually got the lead at ESPN. And I think I still have the business cards of all the informational interviews I got. And then there were folks who, took a chance on me, and I started entry level. And one of the things that was really cool is like the ESPN at the time, and still now, but like it had just, whether it was like the NBA at the time, X Games, all the cool thing about the company is that it just has a myriad of just incredible sort of sports and businesses around that you get to touch so much of the sports landscape, but at the same time have it feel super different, right? Like a story I tell a lot is, I had a chance to, like, when we had NASCAR, you can go from like working on NASCAR to the ESPYs to the NFL to, fantasy football to tournament, like, and it feels like you're working on almost like a different product, that like the iPhone to the iPad to the, the Apple Watch. And I think that's the part that's been so cool about the company. Like how, yes, it all seems like it's sports, but like working on something like F1 feels very different than working on something like soccer, right? And that's the kind of energy that it's been, that you get the chance to do, and you get the chance to like be able to sort of cut your teeth on. And I was lucky enough that I was able to kind of, over the early time of my career, like move around a lot of the sports portfolio, which I think gave me a couple of things. Like one, this sense of, how different fans and different sports and leagues operate. Two, within the company allows you to kind of build a network of relationships of people that ultimately you're going to, do a lot of, work even more closely together as you get into a more sort of like senior level. And I think third, it just kind of like gave me understanding of the business of how important, these portfolios and these properties are to driving not only ESPN, the brand, but the business, but also the connection it has with fans.
I mean, you've really been such a pioneer in this industry, because you have this tenure. You've been through such an evolution yourself as an executive, and also seeing the way the world has changed and this evolution of the consumer. You've got to witness this. You really front row seat at the intersection of all of the sports that people pay attention to. You've gotten to see this world change and be a part of contributing to that in a big way. And now here we are in 2022. What does it look like for you right now? The evolution of the consumer behavior. What are you paying attention to when it comes to how this world is the world is consuming content, reacting to things. I mean, you to me have such interesting perspective going back again 20 years, witnessing these really landmark, things that happen in the world. Yeah, what is it like now, this evolution of the consumer?
The fan and the consumer has probably been one of the most fascinating things that I've had the chance to sort of witness. Let's walk through it. Like if you go back, right, 20 years, 15 to 20 years, the two kind of main ways you would define a sports fan are like two major metrics, right? Like it's like time spent and knowledge, right? So what I mean by time spent is like, all right, hey, I watched 5 college football games this weekend. I'm a huge sports fan. Or, knowledge, like in the sense of like, hey, I can tell you who played first base in 1979, right? For like, and like that, those were kind of like that person's a sports fan. Fast forward today, like what's super interesting to me is like, it's like the sports industry has gone through this sort of like almost like amazing expansion. Right? It's all about like the traditional sports that we know, but there's all of these like adjacent businesses, adjacent sort of ways to consume and connections that surround like the traditional kind of way of like how we think about sports, whether it's betting, whether it's NFTs, whether it's like even fashion, whether it's music. So if sports, like the main sports are like, is like the inside ring, like what's around it is the thing that's formed almost like a solar system, right? Like that around sports in a way that's like incredible. And what is that has then changed the idea of like how you think about fandom, right? So now a fan could say like, hey, I love the sneaker game and like how, NBA, like the tonal fashion, right? For NBA players or like what sneakers they were wearing. I might not necessarily watch a full NBA game, but like I consider myself a huge sports fan, right? I love the way sort of like, Brady takes care of himself in terms of like wellness and recovery and how he eats. And like, because I do love that, I consider myself a huge sports fan, right? So it's like all these different definitions that now people are like, they think, they're sort of living of like, hey, I'm really connecting into sports this way. And thus I'm a big sports fan in a way that like 20 years ago, that was not necessarily the case. Like you had to like watch all these games. You had to like, have like an encyclopedia knowledge of all these things. And I think that's been one of the most interesting things I've seen is like the expansion of what sport means and the fans then who are being brought in to connect with that.
That's so interesting. I mean, you've been credited by bringing the ESPN brand to new audiences, right? You talk about you're at this place of, sports and music and culture, and you've done some, your contribution to some really cool campaigns that we know of. Are you ready? Monday Night Football. That was a great one, which I watched again today, brought me back. But where did that start with this interest in bringing music and connecting ESPN or deepening their roots in the music space? What was that about? Because it's like that was an area you went down and successfully.
Yes. I think one of the things that's really important from a marketing perspective is like great ideas are always based off simple insights, right? And one of the sort of key insights on just sports in general and whether you're thinking about the intersection of, football and music or basketball and music is that there's a huge crossover between music and sports fans. So like, I think we did some like research a bunch of years ago, like the insight was like, 60 or 70% of like football fans are super music fans. Right. So like that alone was like this idea of like music could be a great hook to bring more people in where you're not always having to talk about the stats and like what happened in last night's game. Like you can talk about it in a much more sort of meet that fan and that consumer on their terms. Second, the idea is like athletes want to be musicians want to be athletes. So it's just this like natural kind of cultural like crossover that, ESPN has every right to play in that and like be a facilitator for that type of conversation. What I wanted to do was like pretty simple. It was like leverage, not necessarily think of sports as a sports platform. Think about sports as a music platform that just happens to have sports, right? And which ultimately then opens you up to like doing, I think, a lot of like really interesting things, and like bringing music and having a music conversation in a way that you might not necessarily have if you're just like looking at sports just from one perspective alone.
There was this Hallmark collaboration you were involved in with this first ever exclusive deal with Interscope Records, right, to promote college football. What did you learn in that? Yeah, in that connection and partnership with Interscope. What happened as a result of working with these artists like Diplo and DJ Khaled and Drake for Monday Night Football? What did you learn there? What was it like? Take us inside some of those conversations and some of the things that happened there.
Yeah, Interscope has been a great partner. Awesome relationship with, folks like Steve Berman and Dave Neiman. And I think the thought at the end, like at that point in time, is like, a lot of times in marketing, like what we'll do is like if we're promoting a game, like you'll license a song, right? And like it's just like a cool background track to like promote the game. But what you can do by going deeper and by sort of partnering like more deeply and closer with the label and the artist is that it unlocks so much more, right? So like the whole idea of the Interscope partnership at the time was instead of just like thinking about, all right, like we'll just take your song and like we'll run it. It's like, why couldn't we sort of put this whole like marketing engine on top of what we're doing, right? Why can't we like get the artist to post on their social? Why can't we get the label to like really fully support? Why couldn't we bring this whole conversation and reach all these people that we're not necessarily reaching just having a sports conversation and bring them into the fold? And so that was the whole like merit of it. It's like, you know what? Music offers us the opportunity to have a deeper partnership, and having a deeper partnership, both parties are super invested. And both parties are super invested. That then means we can sort of do more from a marketing perspective. We can unlock a lot more of the sort of channels that wouldn't necessarily be available. And that was like a really awesome playbook for us in the sense of, oh, now like music could be like a lever for like a marketing channel, right? In terms of how we bring more consumers and how we get like a publication like Billboard talking about college football, or how we get, all these other places that might not necessarily sort of, be thinking this sport at the time, be like, oh, wow, this is a thing.
Wow. Incredible. The other thing I know you were heavily involved in was the first ever college football playoff national championship halftime show, right? Which was another big, historic event. There was a big initiative with Kendrick Lamar, who is one of my favorites. So shout out to Kendrick. We'll have him on the show one day. But so just things, monumental moves that I think, again, now you can see the utility of that in other arenas, in more games, more experiences, right? That was a big move, the college halftime show. Yeah,
like I think, for us, the way we've thought about the college football playoff is like we want to make it a Super Bowl type caliber event, right? We don't look at it as just a college football event or a sports event. Like we look at it as this like kind of cultural event. And once you start to put that type of perspective on it, is then you're starting to now bring in different pieces to the conversation. And for us, the national championship game, and like, look, a ton of credit to the NFL and how they've like, done it on the Super Bowl side is like, I think one of the coolest insights we found is like, the highest rated like point of the Super Bowl is halftime, right? Like where you have all these people coming in to sort of see the act. And, one of the areas for us was like, we should take a look at that from a national championship perspective and like use a big moment like music to like not only bring more people and more sort of diverse groups of people at the start of the game, but also kind of like, really sort of bring a ton of people to halftime and create this like huge conversation. And the other thing too for us at the time on the college football side, it was like, how do we now innovate in the space, right? And one of the cool things about it is like, one, we did it outside, right? Like in the park, where it was a free concert and like college kids wearing their like, school colors came through. Two, it was the first time I think anyone had done hip hop and a solo act, right? At a game where like 28 million people show up. So it was just like this idea, and we partnered with Interscope on it, and like a ton of credit to Interscope and Kendrick's people. And it was pretty special. And I think the other thing for us is we thought about, making this a cultural event. Like Kendrick at the time was doing the soundtrack for Black Panther. Right. So we also brought that Black Panther connection in. Like, I think we ran like a trailer right after the concert, which was like this moment. Right. So not only are you having Kendrick, hip hop, outside, national championship, big fields, like big movie aspect on top of it. Like just all of a sudden it starts to put like an event like that, making it a cultural temple versus just a sports temple or a college football temple.
Wow. What's your relationship with just velocity now these days? Being the executive, leading sports marketing at ESPN, seeing how fast the world can change around us, how fast consumer behavior changes in terms of fan behavior and how they consume content, and how fast sports and entertainment are in general. So to me, you've got to have this relationship with speed on how fast you can execute something, right? And you've got to be able to throttle that well, because you want to stay on the cutting edge. You also want to be relevant in a lot of different ways. And I would suspect you have a lot of resources and support at ESPN to make things happen fast. How do you balance that, wanting things to happen fast, having this relationship with growth, seeing things happen, but also tapering that with reality and with, what's happening in the world?
Velocity is a really interesting question. And I'm going to tie it into this idea of like, look, a couple of years ago, like billions of content were coming to people all the time. Like, it's just like, a consumer or yourself or like we're just getting totally like over, just so much coming to us, right? So in a world where there's like a million things, coming at you, is like how, like the fundamental question is, how do you cut through? From a marketer's perspective, the analogy I always use is like Golden State's offense, threes and dunks. It's so kind of crazy, but like, you really have to know what your threes are, right? Like what your big bets and like what you're going to sort of bring a lot of horsepower. And then you have to really know the things that you're going to be super efficient on, right? And I think that's sort of the way we think, right? Like where this idea of one-offs to me doesn't necessarily like, I don't think in a world where there's millions of pieces of content, all sorts of stuff coming at a consumer, a one-off is going to feel like it's like white noise. It's like paint, like white paint on a wall, right? It's going to just fall into the background. So you ultimately have to like have everything has to ladder up into sort of like one sort of big strategy that's ultimately going to pay off for you over the next couple of years. So I look a lot of like our journey of like, all right, how is this sort of all laddering up into like a single piece of thinking and a single piece of how we want the consumer to go. So no individual effort is siloed, right? So everything adds up to it. So like, that's like my three, right? It's like, we're like the things that are our must wins or what we think are like our big foundational building blocks, like we build it over time. So like case in point here, we launched a campaign for the NFL called Ready for Football. And like, we've actually had that campaign for like the last 3 or 4 years because we look at our journey with the like NFL fan, like we look at it as like building each year, like we're adding to that ladder and it's ultimately like going to one place, right? So, and then the other idea is like this idea of like being efficient. So like if you're going to test and learn, like be super efficient, don't necessarily overinvest in it, but like learn a lot as quickly as possible, then essentially rechannel it into that master strategy. So I think marketers now like really have to think about this idea of like threes and dunks in terms of like how they approach stuff. So like which maximizes sort of how you like maximizes your entire marketing pie.
Something I noticed doing a little research on the culture at ESPN, it looks like an incredibly diverse culture. I mean, look at the executive team, super diverse. And it also makes sense that, in many ways, sports is very diverse, but you don't always see big brands with as much diversity. It's a big topic these days. We talk a lot about diversity and inclusion, and we should, but what's it like? Again, it seems like the diversity is almost a secret weapon that ESPN has as well. Like how much of that diversity on the ELT, on the team, just broadly speaking, powers ESPN and powers the impact that they make? Because it looks like a pretty diverse squad there.
Look, I think you answered the question from the jump, right? Like where you know, it has to represent who the sports fan is, right? Like sports fans are probably, over across all these sports are an incredibly diverse group. And at the end of the day, like the best relationship with them is the most authentic relationship, right? And that you have to bring with that experiences, perspective, and understanding, right? So I just think from the jump, like if you can't sort of like match that right internally, like you're always going to struggle, like, building this sort of long lasting relationship that you need to have with like the sports fan. So for us, it's not necessary. It's not a nice to have. It's like, it's an imperative. It's like a must have, right? Because if not, like over time, the sports fan and the consumer will always see right through it. Right. So like, that's how I think the company has been able to sort of create this long lasting relationship, is that at the end of the day, like the sports fan is always good. Like we have to represent that. And like, we have to then represent and we have to show that connection, and we have to represent that connection and their experiences and their perspectives internally for us to have any chance of like either growing that sport and having that, that fan have a connection with ESPN.
How would you describe the culture at ESPN? Like, what would you, when someone asks, like, what's the culture like at ESPN? What would you say to that?
No, the culture is fantastic. Like, look, what's the famous like quote, like culture, eats, strategy for lunch. I'm not sure.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
But there's a reason why, companies continue to sort of, be ahead of it, like continue to have the impact they have, not only in terms of the business of sports, but in culture, like the culture itself, because it's the culture, and the culture is what happens in the dark, right? Like that's what I love. Mm-hmm. It's like when, when you want to reach out to a team, like reaching out to a teammate when you don't have to, right? Going that extra mile for, on a project when you don't have to. And I think that's the type of culture that ESPN has had, is just like, look, we're obsessed about the sports fan. And like, we also look at ourselves as just fans, right? Like that's like, it's super approachable because everyone in the building is like, dude, I love the NBA, right? Like I love cricket, right? Like, and like when you start off as that, right? Then it like, everyone is on a level playing field, right? Everyone is already speaking the same language and everyone knows what the end game is, right? The end game at the end of the day is like, how can we sort of be there, anytime, anywhere in the best possible form for a sports fan? Right? Because like we're living and we have that perspective as a sports fan. And how do we innovate with a sports fan? How do we sort of make sure we match their needs? So I think that alone is, I think, one of the sort of like major things that have like really separated ESPN over the course of a ton of years, is that it's like everyone's coming with this like, dude, like we're fans too, man. And like, once you like break that down, like anything you want to accomplish is pretty easy.
That's great. That's great. That's so awesome. I'm curious about, do you view the role, as vice president of sports marketing at ESPN? Like, do you view it as a game that you suit up for every day and step onto the field? Because I also would imagine that we talked about the speed and the velocity of this massive, content machine, this company, ESPN. It's got to be a lot of pressure. It's got to be a lot of noise, a lot of competing interests, a lot of, things vying for your attention at a high level and all the way down to maybe, integrating things that are lower. How are you dealing with that? Again, a lot of impact is being made by the teams that you support and that work with you and that you support. And that's a lot of pressure, it seems like. So how do you look at that and view that? Because you seem to have this overall attitude about like gratitude that you're in the space that you're in because you're a fan, because you love what you do. But what about the pressure of having this much responsibility of what goes out and what you touch?
Yeah, that's a great question. No, like I think, probably anyone in this role, at this level, what we're doing, like there is definitely like a huge amount of pressure and urgency, right? Like in the world we live, right? In terms of how did that game do? Like, what did it rate? Like, what are we driving over here? And what I try to do is like, I try to sort of like tune out that noise, right? Because in a lot of ways, we're trying to solve like the root issue on stuff, right? Like marketing at the end of the day is like, can you find a root, build a strategy around that, then like ultimately sort of build upon that to like, get to where you need to get to. So perfect example, one of the things I think about, like a couple of years ago on the NFL side, we were thinking about, hey, how do we continue to grow our NFL business from a marketing perspective? What we sort of discovered is like, it's just like a super interesting insight. It's like, all right. So if you look at 12 months out of the year, right, the number one sport the fan is interested in, right, is, let's say it's the NFL, right? Like most consistently, right? And if you look at sort of, who has probably the most NFL outside of the NFL all year round is ESPN, right? So the insight there was like, look, we should be really sort of thinking about marketing the NFL 365 versus just sort of like marketing Monday Night Football, right? So and this is relating to the noise, is like, you don't feel the pressure as much in the noise if your insight, if like because like the way I look at it is like, I'm doing my job right, it's the perfect intersection between the consumer and the business, right? So like if you lean so hard towards the consumer, you miss the business side. If you lean too much business, you miss the consumer. But if you bring those two things together in a way that makes super sense for the fan and the business, then that's where the magic is, right? So like we built this strategy, NFL 365. We did the same thing on the NBA. And now what we're building, like we're building each year. Like we know our strategy and our foundation is right. And we know sort of, our storytelling and the platform we are implementing to bring that to life is right. So it like, you're never sort of feeling the sort of like the short term, like, oh, this happened here, because we know over the next like year or 2 or 3 years, like this is where we want to go. So the way I sometimes think about the pressure is like, look, I'm looking over a 3 to 4 year timeline of how I want to grow that brand and that sport and the strategies that allow us to do that.
Are any surprising insights in the past couple of years? As we all know, the world shifted a lot, and I'm sure one obvious thing is people were consuming a lot more content in the last couple of years. Anything like surprising that you noticed with the data you have access to, the way fan and consumer behavior was shifting? Again, you're thinking about a lot of things already in the future and what's happening now. But any surprise, anything pop up that was like, didn't realize that was going to happen?
The relationship between sort of like watching on broadcast and streaming, right? Like, and how that is sort of, playing out. Because what it's done is it's created this like really interesting fan, right? So like you have a fan who might say, hey, like I just want to watch this game on broadcast or linear cable, what I have. Or a fan might say, hey, I want to watch this game on both, broadcast, linear, and you know what? I also have streaming. Right? So I'm going to watch it wherever is best for me. And you might have a fan who is like, I only have streaming, so I'm just going to watch that game on streaming. And you might have a fan who is like, I don't have any, but I have friends who do, and I'm going to like tag along. So it's created this sort of like consumer that is, super interesting, but they're all interested in the same moment. Right? And so the insight for me is like, we're still in a world, and sports should never give this thing up, is that we all still want to create this cultural moment where everyone is watching the same thing and talking about it at the same time, right? That is ultimately how you break through, right? And that is ultimately how you create these like things that, cultural moments that people are talking about all the time. Perfect example, loved it, like The Last Dance, right? Like the impact of what sports could do, right? Yep. But like what was happening then is like everyone was watching it at the same time and talking about at the same time. And that's the power of sports, right? And sports should never give that up. So like the insight for me is like, as the world gets more fragmented, sports needs to play this role of like still bringing people together to talk about, to live these moments together and to like talk about all these things together. Because like, I think that's like how like we can like really sort of, kind of cut through like all the noise that's happening in society. And I think that's still the power of sports.
Wow. Do you ever get to work on the creative side of campaigns? Like, do you have time to get into that sort of thing and dive into more, creative stuff, or is it?
Yeah, that's a ton of fun. Like, and I think the way I think about stuff is like a lot of this idea of platform strategies and platform platform strategies and creative platforms, where we create something such as, like, great example, like we do something on MLB called Give Us Baseball. Our NBA platform, it's NBA and ESPN time, and like our NFL and ESPN is ready for football. So what the creative platform does is, like, it sets the tenor of the type of relationship we have with the consumer, right? Because now, like, we have a creative platform that allows us to build a relationship and a brand with the consumer. Then essentially throughout the year and every year, we then bring sort of different creative storytelling, but it's all connected to the platform, right? And so over the course of time, it's recognizable but different, but it allows us to kind of like build this sort of, it's almost like kind of like this marriage, right? Like you're just investing and building even just like stronger and stronger bond, that the bond gets better in year 3 versus year 1. The bond gets better in year 4 versus year 2. And that's the thought, like the sort of what I think about in terms of the importance of like platform strategies and creative platforms to go with it, is that you're never restarting the relationship every year with some new campaign, right? Like you're building upon the relationship, which then allows you to kind of like go deeper in your storytelling, tell more stories, because it's all related to where you're ultimately going, and that, like what I said originally, in that sort of 3 to 5 year strategic roadmap that you're thinking about from a marketing perspective.
How much time do you spend looking deeper at, activations and campaigns within certain, franchises or just like at the league level, right? Because you can see it at a really high level, but do you spend time kind of, oh wait, the Timberwolves did something, oh wait, or the NHL's doing this? Like, how much of that plays into your like strategy and innovation?
Huge aspect, right? Like you're always sort of like looking at what the industry is doing. But I'm also a big believer of like, look, we have to run our playbook, right? It's like one of those things, like if Golden State's running their offense, like you're going to open up a shop for like, Steph, right? So like, I think, our thing is like, if we focus on the relationship we have with the fan and like really sort of innovate with them, like we'll get to a place where we can lead, right? Versus being a fast follower. And so the way like we think about, activations is like, how do we continue to deepen and evolve our relationship? So a couple of fun ones, like we sort of just did over the past, years, this idea around sort of simple insights, big ideas. So the goggles in the locker room for the NBA finals, right? So like, that's like an insight of like, hey, like once a team wins, everyone's wearing the goggles, right? So we decided to create this idea, and credit to Arts and Letters, our agency, and also working with the NBA, victory goggles, right? So we took something that happened in the locker room and made it more accessible for fans to play a role in, right? And so that was like super fun. Like we created these special like gold customized victory goggles, and we're able to sort of like, have a ton of fun with that activation. The other one around sort of NFL and our football sort of position in the postseason. Like the insight was like, hey, like once you get into the postseason, one of the leaders in postseason football is ESPN. So like we should create this idea of like a spice called post-seasoning, right? So we created a spice and partnered with,
That's
like,
fantastic.
Yeah. Partnered with, like a great chef to create the spice, and like now became this conversation of like whether you're about to make the playoff, or if you make the playoff, you need post seasoning, right? So it's just like this idea of having a ton of fun and making what's already happening in the culture of sport more accessible to more people to play a part in, right? And then when you think about like the metrics of that, like I think what we think about is a couple of things, right? It's like, one, yes, you want the consumption metric, like impressions, like how you're doing in the earned media space. But like another metric is like the athlete metric. It's like, are the athletes playing a role? Are they giving you a stamp of approval, right? The other like metric I love is like, our league partners and the folks internally just like, oh, this is so cool. Let's work together on this. And the last one is like cultural, right? Are fans who are not just like your avid and hardcore fans like participating? Are you bringing in more diverse sort of casual fans who are like, oh, this is amazing, right? So, and I think that's how we think about like activations is one, if we can run our playbook and be a leader in thinking about like our fan relationship per that sport, and if we can take simple insights and like what's already happening culturally and just bring it and democratize it in a way and bring it to more fans. And then if we can have the impact where athletes are talking about it, you know, different fans from probably different sort of groups are talking about it. It's great with our league partners and internally, and ultimately it's doing what it needs to do from an impression and the earned media perspective to bring more buzz to that particular moment.
Wow. You could also, by the way, weave Post Malone into that post seasoning. I'm just saying you can have that one for free, Emeka, if you want, because that could go nice. You talked about this idea of being an executive of the now and the future, and I'd like you to just again touch on that again and how important that's been for you in your career, and then maybe talk about when that became important for you and how you've been able to navigate again a 20+ year at ESPN and now in this executive leadership role of sports marketing vice president.
Yeah, like I just think generally companies go through probably every 7 to 8, 9, 10, whatever it is. Like there's this stretch like where a company overall has to go through a sense of transition and innovation to keep growing their business, right? And what happens during that transition is that, you know, as executives, like we have to ultimately sort of see like, hey, do we want to be part of that type of transition? And do we want to play an active role in it? And the way I see it is that there's essentially a decision to be made, right? Because the simplified version of it is like change is coming, right? And how am I going to adapt to that change? And am I going to be comfortable with that change? And there's a couple ways you can react, right? Like change can be really difficult on people, or change can be an opportunity. And I've seen throughout my career is like when there's been an element of change, when there's been an element of transformation or transition, that's always been an opportunity for me to grow my career, right? And also, I think for executives overall, it also allows you to kind of like redefine and reinvent yourself, right? And which ultimately, like I think it's important as you think about a 20-year career, is that like reinvention without having the, you know, sort of like the major kind of like be like, oh my God, I went out to do this and you have to like really think about how you reinvent within the company that you're working with, and then what that reinvention means and how does that continue to position you in a place of influence, in a place of like the right sort of growth. So that's the way I've sort of seen it, is like anytime I've made the decision myself to be like, hey, I'm going to be an executive of the now and the future, and I'm going to play a real positive, you know, force and role, even though it might not necessarily be great for me right now. But I think if I play it right, it will be great for me in a year, right? It will be great for me in 2 years, because like ultimately careers are all about like increasing your ceiling, right? So like we all start with a ceiling in our career that is like finite. Like let's say it's like a mountaintop. And yes, you can get promoted vertically, right? And you get that promotion after promotion. I always sort of talk about this as like, be wary of the vertical prison, is that you get promoted to the place where you like hit your ceiling and all of a sudden you're like, there's nowhere to go, right? You haven't developed like extra capacity. Like you have this title, but like strangely enough, like you feel in a less influential place in your career and in a less impactful place. And so what I really believe is like, you want to combine the right level of vertical growth with well-timed horizontal moves, which ultimately increase your ceiling. Why? One, you develop more capacity and skill set, right? Two, you show you can solve other problems other than the problem that you've been like working on. Three, you become more valuable to like a different set of people, right, than the folks that you've been currently working on. And four, it shows the company that like you can be one of the people that they can count on to help either solve difficult things or help like troubleshoot or help sort of grow a business that might not necessarily be as like thought through, but you can be a guy that, you know, can deal with ambiguity, can deal with sort of this change, and then, you know, and go from there. So in a way, it can make you more valuable. And because you've added all this other stuff, now your mountaintop increases, your ceiling increases. And now you can go a little bit, you know, sort of higher. And so that's kind of like what I think a lot about is like this idea of, you know, making sure, and that's where the, you know, the now and the future, and it's like, it's all about like increasing sort of like your ceiling of where your career can go.
Well, take us into the future. You know, it seems like ESPN is already very ubiquitous. You know, I go back to the Are You Ready Monday Night Football campaign. I mean, if anything, that campaign says is like, we're everywhere you want us to be. You know, we're there with you wherever you are watching Monday Night Football. Take us into the future. What are you thinking about now? We have Web3, we have the metaverse, NFTs. How are fans going to be interacting with content? What do you see? Yeah, what do you see happening in the next few years? Because we seem to be moving fast towards a really interesting world.
Yeah, and like what I think about is we're moving fast, right? But we have to also, like, I think for fans, like, slow it down, right? A lot of what I think about is how do we keep the main thing, right? In our relationship with the fan. Because in a world of, look, if you think about the surrounding environment for a consumer and a fan, it's like, you know, you're dealing with COVID and you're dealing with the impact of that on yourself or your family, whoever is impacted. You're dealing with, there's a war in Ukraine. There's, you know, there is a recession might be coming. There's all this stuff that is putting a lot of pressure, you know, on a fan's sort of daily life, right? Then on top of that, then you're dealing with all this sort of content. Everything is moving so fast. And you have to be almost like, you have to be empathetic with the fan and the consumer. It's like, we don't need to move. We don't need to like speed stuff up for them. Like, it's moving fast enough. We actually need to slow it down. So a lot of what I think about is like, for the future is like, how do we create sort of depth with a fan, right? How do we go from less sort of volume to quality? And how do we sort of be more intentional? Like, really sort of know what we want them to lean in on and where we want them to like say, like, all right, cool, that's great, I got it, move on. Right? So it's this idea of like depth, quality, and like intentionality, that, and like slowing it down for the consumer, that I think is going to be a really important thing that we all have to do in the future. How much time are you spending on metaverse and NFTs and, you know, just the utility within your world? What are you noticing? What are you seeing? How bullish are you on those things? Like, what's super cool about some of these, like the metaverse and NFTs, is like the parallel to sports is like, it's community based, right? And so I think it's like, that's the thing. It's like, just break it down. Like, yes, there's a lot of innovation, probably like a lot of executives have to like study and like really understand. But like, if you break it down and look at it at the fan level, it's like, it's all about community. And I think if we can connect with people on that and bring that sort of sports parallel to it, like, I think you can make the right inroads. So that's sort of like, I think where I'm like really paying attention to is like this idea of like community and how that relates to sports. Oh, that's great. Okay. You ready for some lightning round questions? Yeah, let's do it. Okay, let's do it. So these will be, you know, lightning round. So try to answer, you know, as quick as you can, answer from the heart, the gut, if you will. And before we do that, I want to just give a shout out to our sponsor for the show. Salesforce is our partner for marketing trends. And when you think about marketing and engagement being brought together, you can learn more at salesforce.com/marketing. We have Emeka Ofodile, Vice President of Sports Marketing at ESPN, in the virtual studio today. Emeka, are you ready for the first lightning round question? Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it. Okay. What's your favorite thing about New York? Accessibility. Like, I think not necessarily accessibility in the sense of like walking down. It's just like once you like get down your steps, like everyone's on the same plane.
Okay.
Right.
Do you have a favorite daily ritual that you do, like morning ritual or evening ritual?
Yeah, I got to work out.
Okay.
Right. Like in the morning, if not, my head's all over the place. So like, I think one of the things is like making sure you take care of your mind and body. And for me, is like working out in the morning.
Okay. What does it look like for Emeka to just think? Like, do you go off and put on music? Do you go for a walk? Like, do you shut all the windows and the doors? Like, what do you set up when you just have to think?
Yeah, it's all of that. Like anytime you can find quiet space, right? So like it could be showering, it could be going for a walk. It could be sort of like up because I listen to a lot of music late at night, just like by myself. And that's like where you have to do is like, just like you have to find those quiet moments to like think.
Who do you connect with just to bounce strategy off of? Like when you're thinking through the impact of things at your level, who's someone that you're like, you know what, I want a sounding board in this. Is there anyone that comes up for you?
Yeah, no, like, look, I think, you know, just even my department, like obviously my boss, Laura, you know, I have peer groups that, you know, I talk with, like cross-functioning, I talk with, like, I think easiest thing to think about, like the way I look at balancing strategy is that the more people and the more inputs you can get in perspective on what's actually going on with the sport will allow you to sort of get to the right place strategically.
Okay. What's the last time you tried something new?
Oh, that's that's a good question. You know, probably a couple of weeks ago, you know, I tried sort of to make, I usually like do a smoothie in the morning, and that's kind of like my whole like, hey, I'm trying to get healthy, and I tried something else, and like that wasn't great. It wasn't a good move.
Okay.
Yeah.
What is an activity that makes you lose track of time?
Spending time with like my two girls and my wife. You know, it's super fun when I can like actually have that family time away from everything.
Yeah, that's the best. I agree with you there, man. There's nothing better than the time with the kids. Would you rather lose all of your old memories or never be able to make new ones? If you had to pick one,
like, you know what? Like, I'd rather lose all my old memories and live in the moment in the future.
Okay. What is something that you are personally betting on for the future? Just what are you betting on for the future?
I'm betting on people, right? Like, I think the only way we get through things and the only way we either make a difference, turn things around, it always goes through people. So you always have to bet on people.
What's something that impresses you today?
You know, one of the things that is like just super impressive for me is like, I'm going to kind of relate it back to the like people aspect. Is just like, I think just like this next generation of like folks, or whether you want to call it Gen Z and all that, like how they're sort of rising up and how they're defining like who they want to be and like, and what they're trying to, you know, change in the world. And I think it's going to be interesting to sort of see what their impact will be on society and like things like sports themselves. But, you know, and like you see that with athletes now, right? Like kind of like, you know, people feel like they have a platform and they're living it and bringing a lot of conversation to the forefront.
If you had access to a time machine, where would you go?
Like, I'm always interested in like the most kind of like the best times for like a sporting period.
Okay.
Right. So it's like you know, living through, you know, whether it's like the 90s of, you know, Jordan, or going back, you know, a bunch of years ago to sort of seeing like World Cups, like between Pele, like, you know, take me to like when like the stakes are the highest, the conversation was the highest. And I like just want to live that and like see what that felt like.
Okay. Besides ESPN, what's your favorite app on your phone?
Oh, besides ESPN, like, I don't know, like I love sort of, you know, Twitter and, you know, anything that allows me to like stay like connected with like what's going on, like real-time conversation.
Okay. Last question is, what's one thing you'd want to do this year that you've never done before?
One of the things that probably maybe have never done before, like maybe like because we've all lived through this COVID time for the last couple of years, it feels like 1,000 years. But I do want to, like, because we have, like, you know, we have a 6-year-old girl, and we have a, you know, our second girl is 16 months. I do want to, it feels like we've never done it before, but I do want to take my wife somewhere.
Okay.
Like,
I get it.
Like, it's just like, let's just get out.
Let's go. I get it.
For a couple of days.
I get it. Cool. Well, thank you, Emeka. This has been an incredible conversation. We're honored to have you on the show. Such an insightful dialogue, man. Congratulations to you and your family and the whole team at ESPN. Don't stop. Keep going, because we're definitely paying attention.
Oh, thank you, Jeremy. This was great. Like, and awesome questions too. Like, really great dialogue. Kudos to you.
Amazing. Thank you, sir. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. Please subscribe to this channel for more great marketing interviews with today's top industry leaders. And thank you to our partners at Salesforce. Salesforce brings marketing and engagement together. Head over to salesforce.com/marketing.